What is up, substantial people? Hey, listen, I am here with someone that we all know. He is a substantial family member and supporter of ours. I absolutely love and adore this brother. We are here with Brother James White. Brother James White, thank you so much for taking a little bit of time with us on this Sunday evening. I am always one of those folks that I have so often the opportunity to experience people and like just they pour into me like knowledge and their wisdom and insight and nuggets. And there's no way, right, if I'm really out here trying to make sure that other folks understand how substantial we are, that I just hold that, bottle it up for myself. And so I am super grateful that you are allowing us to kind of record this conversation and have this conversation and then share it out in our networks with the world. So I already know all about who Brother James White is, and a lot of the folks that rock with Substantial should already know who you are too. You're the brother that came and put it down for us during the Black Land Symposium. You are the brother that came when we had the conversation about Ahmaud Arbery and just a lot of what was happening with the Black Lives Matter movement. And you are a brother that anytime we need someone to talk about the history and connect it in a way to where we are right now in these moments that we call on. And so we know who you are, but for those that may be for the first time listening and having an opportunity to hear you, can you tell us a little bit about Brother James White, who you are, what you do, and where you hail from?
Well, Greg, first of all, it is a gift to be with you as well. And man, I love watching you journey in such a way that really has been a change agent, a voice, that you allow the story systemically to be told in such a way that I think will change and will continue to change the culture, and absolutely very substantial. So I'm James Alfred White. I grew up in Eastern North Carolina, married to my queen, my incredible wife of 34 years, and we have 3 adult children as well. And I've been here in the Triangle since 1991. Worked at Howard there with college students and campus ministry for about 7, 8 years before moving here, and moved here to work with a think tank that dealt with culture and understanding communication skills, and even how to think deeply if you're going to bring about change. And so did that for a few years, worked for the YMCA for 16 years as an executive vice president of leadership development and then organizational relations. Now, for the last year, ever since George Floyd took place in Minneapolis, because one of the things, in spite of doing all of that, have often served as a consultant, thinker, advisor, leadership coach for a number of people across the country, but was doing some work for the United Health Group Equity and Innovation Center of Excellence in Minneapolis around sort of the history of the difference between a protest and a riot, and just gave some historical background around that, and ended up developing a relationship to where now for the last year, I really spend my time as a principal communicator and facilitator for the United Health Group Equity Innovation Center. I'm the vice president of leadership and curriculum development. So I would say in this next season in my life and my journey, getting a chance to engage in conversations that I think have been part of my story from the very beginning.
Wow, wow. So when that thing is when you're in alignment, right, and you're doing exactly what you've been put here to do, it's crazy how those opportunities, those doors, and those things open up. And so I want us, if you will, because again, right, I love how you story tell about our history, because we're February 27th. Tomorrow, February 28th, is going to conclude for us this Black History Month. But talk to us though about how important it is that while we acknowledge and celebrate our stories within this month, this short month of February, that we not forget that things continue to happen, people continue to aspire and grow and do. So talk to us about the importance of Black History Month But then what should happen thereafter?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things that even as this has come about as sort of the conversation that we often have, we often have told jokes and we've said, why is February the shortest month and why is that got to be chosen for Black History Month? And I think this is where, for me, I really view history as a story because all of us live and thrive, and our humanity is interwoven in this idea of what really is our story. And that's what Carter G. Woodson did in 1926. And so I think one of the things that becomes real important is to even understand the origin of Black History Month and how it came about in February is because Dr. Carter G. Woodson, and by the way, he's the second PhD Black man from Harvard. The first was W.B. Du Bois. The second is Carter G. Woodson. And when Carter G. Woodson, he chose February because at that time in 1926, in American culture, there are really two people who were well known. And think about this for a moment. 1926, the time period, that's only 63 years since the Emancipation Proclamation. So in American history at that time, two of the most famous people were Abraham Lincoln and Frederick Douglass. And both of those people, their birthdays are in February. So in his wisdom and insight of wanting the narrative of Black history to be placed at a time in American psyche when it would be accepted, he chose a month that had two people that were respected on a broad scale. Now, what is genius about Carter G. Woodson that we miss as well is even in his own story, he starts high school at age 20, and he was born to his parents who were former slaves. And so he's carrying the narrative of Black history in such a way that he knew that education and story was what was going to be needed to release the false narratives that America had for 246 years of slavery. And now we've only had a brief window to where we haven't had slavery. So Carter G. Woodson understood of placing it at this time so that America, first of all, would engage the idea. Now, notice what I'm saying, America, because we often think, and we often think it in a way that even we sometimes as Black people, we diminish Black History Month, because one of the things that I'm trying to change, even as I give voice to this, is that this month is not Black history, this is American history. This is giving the complete narrative. And so for some of us, if we do find ourselves at that idea that, okay, what do we do next? It's because we haven't really understood our own story. Now I'm speaking to Black people. Because the truth of history and story is something that I can't turn off if I want to, because my story of what we've talked about these last few weeks is embodied in my very being. History is not just an intellectual exercise of knowledge of facts, but history is a narrative journey that we embody. Now, why do I say that? And we don't have enough time to go into the epigenetics and all the other dynamics of this. But think about this just for a moment, this simple idea. When you go to a doctor, the doctor is going to ask you these questions before you even go into his office. Family history. Did your daddy have a disease? Did your mama have high blood pressure? Where is this in your family? Because we carry our stories not just in our minds, but in the very essence of our internal world and our beings. And we carry our stories in our bodies as well. So I think the issue becomes in these next days, now moving into March, will we choose to minimize our story? Because that's what happens to some of us. Some of us, we minimize our story because we haven't even wrestled with our own story of what it really means to be a Black person. Now,
That's
again,
good.
when I say a Black person, I'm talking about those people who came here as a result of the diaspora, those people who came here as a result, again, of the slave trade, those people whose roots and heritage are skin that has been influenced by the slave trade. And so that naming of Black is a name, again, because of the slave trade going through, again, the Spanish realities and the Portuguese of the slave trade, then absolutely the word Negro is another word for Black. So that origin, but then it was also repurposed to be the naming of something that one thinks that is negative, that now we would turn it into something positive. And incidentally, I know I'm going further than what you've asked, Greg, but incidentally, Black is a response to, again, the reality that even there's no such thing as a white person. It's so interesting because in my age, I remember when we started using the term Black at the end of the movement here in the transition of the civil rights movement into the 1970s is when the term became coined. And I would always have white friends say, well, why should I call you Black? Because you're certainly not Black. And I would always say and think in my mind, that's an interesting, strange question. A better question would be the truth of why should I call you white? Because that's an even better question, because now we see the political systemic creation of whiteness that does not exist as well. There's no such thing as a white person, but yet our laws, our documents, our realities and our laws, even when we go back to Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, that we establish a whole systemic reality and building of America based on the construct that was a false construct that we created because of Bacon's Rebellion, Virginia House of Burgess, because in many ways we had to come up with a way of systemically giving power away at the cost of dehumanizing a group of people, and we create a false narrative of whiteness. Now, what I've done in these last few moments is very much what often we have to do is give a lot of thoughts and ideas in a brief period of time. And in this conversation, I feel free to do that because we have now a device where we can Google, where we can fact check. So I'm going to be free to flow in this conversation.
Yes.
With ideas and everything that may sound like quite a bit in a short period of time.
Listen, no, this is why I had to make sure this conversation is not only had, but recorded. You know, we always have our moments where we connect. And I'll just act like it is so important, you all. I need y'all to understand what I'm saying. When you have people like this in your space, right, within a reach of you that has just so much insight, so much knowledge, experience, right? You've experienced some things. I remember you telling me about, you know, your father serving in the war and then having to come home and take that stuff and hide it because he feared that he would be like, I mean, like when you have people like that in your network, and they're willing to pour into you those conversations, those things, it changes the mentality and the mindset that you have. And I appreciate you for that. And that's why it's always important that we reach back, right? And we understand that that has to come with us. We've got to keep that. We've got to, because we're destined to repeat some of the exact same mistakes if we don't know where we've been. And I've heard you even say that a lot more elegantly. So I have to ask, right? You put it out there as you always do. Some would almost argue though, right? Right now in this space that we exist in, and I don't know why they argue this, I'm gonna just put it out there. The question was even posed to me once. Like, is there even a reason to still celebrate Black History Month in February? Because of some of what you just described, but also what others are saying is now like, well, y'all, why y'all trying to be so separate? I thought it was American history. Why do you gotta have a Black History Month? Why they gotta teach my children in these schools that these things happen? So I pose that same question to you in the sense though, do we still need to acknowledge and have this moment to really lift up and celebrate the fact that we have contributed so much to the, you know, advancement of society?
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that because I think in order for all of us to understand how to move forward,
Mhm.
you've got to have the truth of the past. Now, when you ask me, do we need it? It's interesting that you're asking me at a time period where we already know that we're still wrestling with the data that shows you the inequities that go in every dimension of life, whether we're talking healthcare, whether we're talking economics, that we still are living into systems and structures that we're still questioning the humanity of Black people. I mean, uh, where do I need to pull an example? Let me pull an example from what we think is a neutral place, such as sports. One's got to ask themselves, how is it that 70% of the people who are the performers, the players, the performers, that 70% of them are Black people, and yet only two in the whole NFL are Black people who are the directors, the producers, those who lead and guide. After all of these years, and the same narrative can go in baseball, basketball, etc., men or women's sports. Even that alone lets us know that there's still a need to give special attention, because even the stories that we have of our past, we're now discovering and understanding that they haven't been told in a way that is correct. For example, if I was to say Dred Scott case, Plessy versus Ferguson, Brown versus Board of Education, Loving versus Virginia, those are just, again, four major Supreme Court cases that have shaped the American psyche of America. Dred Scott, again, the psyche, the idea that a person is property. And therefore, Dred Scott, even though he comes from a slave, he has his freedom, but he's in a state that doesn't have slavery, that is a state that does not have slavery. He's still property and has to be given back to his master. Plessy versus Ferguson, that this idea that you can have, and this is what's great, that a certain amount of blood in your system makes you ineligible to sit in a car for a particular race of people. And the Supreme Court case says separate but equal, and that would be in place for 99 years. Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, which was supposed to strike down separate but equal, but we all know that it's not until 1965 that the Civil Rights Act has to come in and make sure that that is the case. And yet, even in 1965, when that happened, you had institutions, nonprofit organizations who have mission statements that would suggest that they're for everyone. But many of them did not desegregate it until being forced. And even school systems in North Carolina, you have in 1954, again, Brown versus Board of Education, but Charlotte's school system didn't even desegregate until the early 70s. And then it's not until 1967, I am 7 years old at this time, that Loving versus Virginia. Now this is what we got to ask ourselves this question. How in the world could the Supreme Court, why would the Supreme Court have to pass a law of anti-miscegenation laws? Anti-miscegenation laws, which now says that, you know what, it is okay. It's not a health risk. There's nothing that is going to be dangerous about people from two different races being married. 1964, the highest court of the land is going to have to force states. Evan, sorry for that pause. 1967,
no, you're fine.
Think about this for a moment. That America has to, by the highest court of the land, make it legal for people who love each other to be married across racial lines. And it wasn't until the 70s and 80s that some state took the anti-miscegenation laws off of their books. So why do we need a Black History Month in February? Because these things will not be in focus, because these things are part of the fabric of America that helps us to establish our humanity of where we've been so we won't go there again. And truth is not truth if you don't include both triumph and trauma. And all too often, this is the month where we get a chance. Yes, it's fine for us to talk about the celebrations, but we are also reminded of some of the traumatic realities that have made us who we are. It is clear that when you look again at history, and we forget this, but America was built through the brutality of slavery. Why do I say the brutality of slavery? Because we're talking about cotton. And when cotton becomes the major industry building reality of America, and even when you think about the fact that part of the expansion of America was so that we could grow more cotton, and we have to take human bodies who are not people but products in order to do that, all of that is part of our American story. And that's important to help all of us have a healthy existence. And this is what is so unfortunate about those who have a hard time when we talk about ideas that we are now using to stop a more effective teaching of history. I'm not talking about rewriting history. I'm talking about and that effective teaching is not about blaming, it's about naming. And so it's about having a more effective narrative, a more human narrative, rather than a narrative of heroes who were never even human. And that helps us to have, I think, a better idea of how we engage one another with a level of humility. But all of our systems and structures have been built off of these root foundations. And if you're going to bring change, if you don't change the root foundation and systems, then you're not going to have change in our world today. So this teaching of history becomes important. It is not just so that Black kids can have a more accurate understanding and see themselves in their genius, but it is also so that all kids, so that white kids can begin to see some of the dynamics as well, not to shame or blame, but to name so that we can have a healthier reality of even as we journey today. It's one of the reasons too, Greg, is because I am the generation of integration. And if we would have had integration in a healthier manner, to where even then there should have been a rehaul of the educational system, but that rehaul of the educational system would also be a rehaul of engaging in relationships and connections. But we just said integration and we opened doors, but we never showed people how to be at home. And we never created spaces so that people could be at home in those spaces that we integrated. It is the same thing that many companies are having to play catch up on. You can have as many quotas, hire as many people, Black people, people of color, people of different dimensions of diversity. But if you don't do the work of creating systems and structures of belonging and where someone can be at home, then it is meaningless and it is pointless. And that's why understanding the history of all these things, because we live in a world where we should want to grow in our design and our development and who we are as human beings.
Listen, let me tell y'all something. That in itself can be an entire masterclass. What you just did, and I need them to understand why I bring you into these spaces so that you can just a little drip of it, right? Like just a little bit. And I've got to ask, right? I remember you saying things like I always tell you sparks these thoughts in my head, and these things start firing off, man. And it reminded me at the end of what you just mentioned, where you were like, that's what the problem was with integration. That quote from Dr. King, that was, "I fear I may have integrated my people into a burning house."
Yes.
Right? Like that notion of, I have been fighting so hard to get my people in these spaces, and now look at what I have done, right? Like it just, that, and I just go there because of that last part that you mentioned of there should have been this, if you will, this transition, this stepping stone, these lessons learned, conversations had that allowed us to get there. And I think back also to a conversation I had with some folks earlier in the month where we were playing the roles, believe it or not. It was a very interesting program. I had the opportunity to play the role of Marcus Garvey, right? there was someone who played the role of Dr. King, someone who played the role of Malcolm, someone who played the role of W.E.B. Du Bois, someone I believe who played the role, and I apologize, the name escapes me, but another famous African American man of our history. And what was crazy about it was the questions weren't posed to us in a manner by which we were saying what back happened then, but if you were alive right now, today, I have Martin with me, I have Marcus with me, and I want to ask you this question, right? And we had to channel, if you will, the philosophies and the conversations and quotes and things that they would have embodied then. And so as you were talking, it took me back to that program. And I recall there was a part in the conversation where Martin and Malcolm and everybody were talking about the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments and how it ended slavery. And as we began to fight, that Jim Crow choked the life out of progress. And I know there's a moment where you have talked to me about understanding the time frames and the timeline of American slavery,
Yes.
segregation,
Yes.
and where we are right
Yes.
now.
Yes. Yeah, you listen, so you just stirred a couple things. There should be a master class in what you just talked about, because what you just talked about, this example that you gave, is one of the keys. We're throwing the word empathy around.
Yes.
But one of the keys to really developing empathy is, how do you help a person participate in another person's experience?
Yes.
The technical name for it, there's a professor, Dr. Timothy Muehlhoff, who, man, this is back in the 90s. He talked about this, but it's this idea of a participatory epistemology. And what that is participating in another person's experience and learning through that participatory epistemology. One of the people who you should Google, who is brilliant at this, who is incredible, is Anna Deavere Smith. Anna Deavere Smith has this ability to play the characters of men, women, and she literally is an incredible woman, but she takes on that character. She's participating in that person's experience. And that's what you're talking. And this is, again, why this month is important, because at this month we focus on this experience, but how do we begin helping all people begin to participate in that experience? You know, Greg, I believe if we wanted to find a solution to some of the economic challenges and some of the health challenges that exist in our world, or if we want to find a solution even when we're trying to figure out how do we bring a sense of peace and unity, then one should want to participate in the experience of a people who have been oppressed for 246 years. And yet out of that oppression, they go through, again, an Emancipation Proclamation and a Reconstruction that lasts only a brief period of time. But even in that brief period of time, there's still a level of leadership and wealth that was built. But then even with, again, the brutality, once again, the terrorism, that whether it was Wilmington in 1898, or whether it was, again, Topeka, Kansas, and Greenwood or Rosewood, and yet with all of that, you still have a people who are still trying to move through the space through nonviolent means. And doing that in a country that has given us a model that the only way you can bring change in American Revolution is violence. The only way you can really bring, again, freedom is give me liberty or give me death. And yet this group of people who have been tortured, abused, dehumanized, not people but treated as products, still to this day has decided we want to do this through peaceable means, through systems and structures that have failed us. Someone ought to study that in detail. That would give you a model of how in the world do you come about change through peaceable means. And we're missing the genius and brilliance of that happened in the lives of those people of African descent, who sometimes I scratch my head and wonder, why are we not more violent?